This is my first YouTube video, and there's some kind of annoying buzzing noise coming from the microphone, so I don't know what to tell you, just have to deal with it. What I wanted to talk about was some things I've encountered talking on different libertarian websites and reading books and so forth. And that's the kind of persistence of the natural rights and natural law libertarianism. It's more or less a sort of deontological or transcendental set of moral claims. I mean, they try to say it's based on human nature, or some of them will even actually try to make references to praxeology, which is basically economics if you're not familiar with it. But it's always kind of arbitrary and disingenuous. You know, anything that doesn't suit their preconceptions of what a human life is, or, you know, sort of the same thing with Aristotle, what's a rational life. It more or less gets thrown out the window, and all that's left is, property exchange. And, well, yeah, I mean, if you define as natural everything that fits into a catalactic framework and then throw out everything else, then obviously your natural rights are going to end up looking a lot like libertarianism. I mean, but it's arbitrary. There's nothing natural or unnatural about it as far as we would usually use the word. And I'm not trying to strictly work within, biological naturalism in this sense. I mean, there are certain sort of logical facts about existence and everything that do have bearing on human action and, what's possible, what makes sense, and so forth. But there's just absolutely nothing in that to give any sort of normative support for libertarianism. I mean, Max Stirner and Ludwig von Mises, their value subjectivism is basically the same. They end up saying, whatever people want, whether they're mistaken in their ideas or not, is entirely subjective, and it's related to values that only exist, at least as values, for them. So if somebody honestly wanted to run around just murdering people, and they were fully informed of the likely consequences and so forth, I can't see that there's any way you can make a claim against that. They may be an asshole, but being an asshole is not some violation of logic or anything. It's quite obviously possible to be an asshole, whereas it is, for example, not possible to have a socialist economy. That would be a contradiction in terms. There are a few sort of subsidiary either derivations or attempts to encapsulate what they mean by this sort of liberal libertarian theory. And those would be the non-aggression principle or axiom. Either way, it doesn't really make a difference. And it doesn't really make sense because, I mean, what is aggression? I mean, every time that, say, I make a contract with somebody for, to exchange X for Y, there is an implicit threat of coercion behind both my ownership of X and his ownership of Y, which means that I can't just take it. And, the whole term voluntarism kind of falls apart on the same grounds. Voluntary within what context? I mean, you are violently enforcing property norms, and I'm not going to say there's anything wrong with that, but I think you need to face that fact and stop pretending like, suddenly you've got property and we're all just in this magical fairyland where everybody does what they want. Everybody does what they want insofar as they don't, piss off other people and get sued or, arrested for breaking into somebody's house or whatever. And those may be, what most people would consider trivial restrictions. Those are real restrictions. Those are violently enforced. And it's obvious if you see that the way some of these, workers' parties and so forth get all pissed off about capitalists and rich people, usually for stupid reasons, but, it isn't immediately obvious that everyone would just agree to that, even if they understood everything. People are, they're jealous and they're Quite frankly, they're pretty stupid too. So, yeah, you really can't just say non-aggression or voluntarism. I mean, they have no problem with these words in themselves, but you really have to say in what context, you know. It doesn't establish anything. It doesn't give you sort of metaphysical high ground. You know, there's never been a social order that didn't use violence. I would tend to agree that a sort of liberal property norm organization with a state or without a state would involve less actual deployment of violence, although not necessarily less implicit threats of violence. And you know, it tends to create less divisions within society. It tends to disincentivize certain kinds of what we might call antisocial behavior. But there's absolutely, you know, violence there, and even if it was somehow never enforced, nobody ever actually shot at anybody or what have you, it's implicit. Otherwise, you know, if you don't even in theory resist somebody taking your property, then you don't have property. You're just sort of drifting through the world. When I talk to a lot of these natural rights people, some of them will grant some of the things I'm saying, and will agree that, you know, we just mean within this context. For the most part, they don't even seem to get it at all. They start asking questions that are unrelated to the issue, and they really seem to be trapped in an ideological box that reminds me of talking to super religious people. I mean, there are things that they object to that they shouldn't necessarily find objectionable. I mean, for example, there is the system of liberal proprietarianism, you know, and you believe that there's some absolute moral right to having property, then you're imposing that on other people if you defend your property and whatnot, or, you know, set up some sort of government or, you know, private protection agency, whatever, that does so. And that's definitely an imposition on those people. You're using violence to impose it. You may think it's justified violence, but it's obviously violence, and it's obviously coercion. I mean, there's no getting around that. And I think really this comes from a bunch of 18th century nonsense that, for historical reasons, worked itself in with basically a bunch of sound economic and sociological positions, and has sort of infected the libertarian movement. And your low grade or, you know, common man libertarian knows absolutely nothing but these sorts of positions, and they seem, you know, confused why it doesn't convince people. The reason it doesn't convince people because it doesn't make any fucking sense. Their usage of the term aggression or their conceptions of property are just as valid prima facie as yours are. Okay, so there may be internal problems with them, contradictions involved. They may lead to weird, ridiculous results that almost nobody would want if they knew about it. But you have to get into that. You really have to look at the consequentialist and utilitarian, as well as, you know, some formal logical restrictions. I mean, anybody advocating socialism is just fucking ignorant. I mean, it's not possible to do unless, you know, you literally wanted everybody to starve and society to collapse. But, you know, it's practically nobody. Maybe Bob Black. So yeah, that's it. I think libertarians are libertarianism's worst enemy, and you need to stop being crazy and start, you know, referring to the actual arguments that probably convince you to be a libertarian in the first place.